stoke that fire a little bit. Yeah, get those flames jumping. The story I'm about to tell you, it needs a little light to push back the dark. This isn't a fairy tale about talking animals. This is a true story about blood and dust and the absolute will to stay alive when the whole world wants you dead. We're going to a place called the Sabi Sand down in South Africa. Now, I want you to close your eyes for a second. Imagine heat. No, not like a hot summer day at the beach where you need an extra bottle of water. Forget that. I'm talking about heat that feels heavy. Heat that presses down on your shoulders like a physical weight. Picture a drought. The worst drought anyone had seen in years. The land isn't green. It's dead. The ground is just cracked, baked mud that crunches under your boots. The air is so dry it feels like you're breathing in sandpaper. Every time the wind blows, it just picks up this fine, red dust that coats your teeth and gets in your eyes. You're constantly thirsty, and there's no water anywhere. The rivers are just sand pits. The animals are walking skeletons, ribs showing through their skin, just waiting to drop. It's a graveyard waiting to happen. That's where our story begins. In that hellscape, living right in the middle of that nightmare, was a family of lions. We called them the Sparta Pride. And listen to me, these weren't the happy, sleepy lions you see at the zoo. They couldn't afford to be. The mothers in this pride, man, they were made of iron. They were tough, scarred, pissed-off survivors. They didn't have time for weakness. You know how some moms coddle their babies? Not Sparta moms. If a cub couldn't keep up, it got left behind. It sounds cruel, I know, but out there, in that drought, weakness is a disease. You can't let it slow the group down, or everyone dies. These lionesses were constantly moving, constantly hunting, desperate to find just enough meat to make milk for their babies. They were running on fumes and fury, and it wasn't just the hunger they were fighting. It was the odds. Lean in a bit. Let me tell you a scary statistic. In the wild, 80% of lion cubs die before their first birthday. 8 out of 10. Think about that. If 5 cubs are born, 4 of them are probably going to be dead within a year. Why? Because everything out there wants to eat a baby lion, especially at night. When the sun goes down in the Sabi Sand, the horror movie starts. You're lying there in the pitch black, trying to sleep, and you hear them. The hyenas. It starts with those weird, low, whooping calls, like they're signaling each other. Over here, I found something. And then comes that sound. You know the one. That insane, high-pitched cackling. It sounds like a bunch of lunatics laughing in an asylum. But it's not funny. It's terrifying. It's the sound of a gang circling in the dark, smelling fear, waiting for a mother to take her eyes off her cub for just 10 seconds. That laughter is usually the last thing a lot of cubs ever hear. The night belongs to the monsters, and the Sparta Pride was living right in the middle of them. Now, picture this. Against all those odds, the drought, the starvation, the hyenas, 5 little males were born into the Sparta Pride. 5 brothers. They were clumsy little things, all fuzz and big paws they hadn't grown into yet. They'd tumble around in the dust, biting each other's ears, trying to roar but only making these little squeaking sounds. But here's the thing that made their situation truly desperate. The thing that made them the ultimate underdogs. They didn't have a dad. In the lion world, the father is the shield. He's the muscle. A big male lion is the only thing that stops other strange males from coming in, killing the cubs, and taking over the females. It's brutal, but that's how it works. Without a father to protect them, those 5 little brothers were walking targets. They were trespassers in a violent world. Their moms were tough, yeah, but they couldn't fight off a full-grown 500-pound male lion looking for trouble. These 5 little guys started their lives with absolutely nothing going for them except each other. They were living on borrowed time from the day they were born. And one evening, that time almost ran out. It was twilight. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, and the sky was this bruised purple color. The heat was finally letting up just a little bit. The 5 brothers were huddled together in a dry riverbed, hidden in some thick grass. Their moms were gone, miles away, trying to hunt something in the dark. The cubs were waiting, quiet, like they were taught. They were hungry. They were always hungry. Suddenly, the smallest brother stopped playing. His little ears swiveled forward. He froze. The other 4 stopped too, watching him. He smelled something. The wind shifted, and it hit them all at once. It wasn't the smell of a buffalo. It wasn't the rotting smell of a hyena. It was sharp, musky, and overwhelming. It was the scent of a grown male lion. But it wasn't a scent they knew. It was a stranger. Then they heard it. The sound of heavy paws crunching on the dry sand, slow, deliberate, coming right toward them. A shadow detached itself from the darkness of the bush. It was massive. A huge male lion stepped into the clearing. He had a thick, shaggy mane full of thorns and a nasty scar across his nose. He wasn't from around there. He was a nomad, a killer looking for territory. He stopped just 20 feet away. He lowered his massive head and locked his yellow eyes right on those 5 little cubs huddled in the grass. He let out a low rumble. It wasn't a roar. It was deeper than that. It was a vibration that shook the ground beneath their little paws. Their moms were miles away. They were completely alone, and the reaper was staring right at them. Listen to the wood pop. It sounds like bones snapping, doesn't it? Keep that sound in your head, because where we're going, that's the soundtrack to every single night. We're back in that dry riverbed. The sky is a bruised purple. The air is thick with the smell of dust and coming death, and those 5 little Sparta brothers are staring into the eyes of a monster. Picture this. This giant, this titan, steps out of the shadows. He didn't just walk. He claimed the ground he stood on. This was Makulu. That's the name he'd eventually be known by. And it means the Great One. But right then, to those cubs, he was just the end. He was massive. I'm talking about a lion that looked like he'd been put together with steel, cables, and old leather. His mane wasn't that golden, pretty hair you see in picture books. It was thick, matted, and black. Black as a coal mine. It made his head look double the size it actually was. And his face, man, his face was a road map of every fight he'd ever been in. Scars across his nose, notches missing from his ears, and eyes that didn't look like an animal's eyes. They looked like the eyes of a man who had seen everything and decided he didn't like any of it. You wouldn't believe the silence in that moment. It was so quiet, you could hear the blood pumping in your own ears. The 5 brothers were huddled so tight They were basically one ball of fur. Their little hearts were beating like hummingbirds. Thump, 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 waiting for the inevitable. Because you have to understand the law of the bush. When a strange male finds cubs that aren't his, he kills them. He doesn't think about it. He doesn't feel bad. He just snaps their necks or crushes their skulls to clear the way for his own bloodline. It's cold. It's efficient. It's nature. Makulu took one more step. His massive paw, bigger than a man's head, landed in the sand without a sound. He lowered that huge, scarred face. He was so close the cubs could feel the heat coming off his body. He could smell their fear. He could smell the milk still on their breath. One of the brothers, the smallest one, let out a tiny, pathetic whimper. He closed his eyes and tucked his head, waiting for the teeth. We're talking a split second between life and a messy, violent death. But then the impossible happened. Makulu didn't open his jaws. He didn't roar. He didn't strike. Instead, he reached out and took a long, deep sniff. He moved from one cub to the next, his nose twitching, taking in their scent. And then, in a move that defied every rule of the animal kingdom, he just sat down. He didn't kill them. He chose them. It was a miracle. A dark, strange miracle. For some reason, maybe he was tired of being alone. Maybe he saw something in those 5 pathetic runts. Makulu decided that these weren't victims. They were his. But don't get it twisted. He wasn't a dad. He wasn't there to nuzzle them and play. He was a warlord, and he had just found his first recruits. From that day on, everything changed for the Sparta brothers. The 80% death rate we talked about? Makulu looked at those odds and spat on them. He became their general. He didn't feed them, at least not at first. He made them watch. When he killed a buffalo, he didn't call them over to have a nice family dinner. He made them fight for their spot at the carcass. He was teaching them that in this world, if you want to eat, you have to be the meanest thing in the valley. Imagine these 5 cubs following this black-maned giant through the bush. He was teaching them how to walk, not like prey, but like kings. He taught them how to use the wind so the prey couldn't smell them. He taught them how to stare down a pack of 40 hyenas until the hyenas were the ones who backed away. He wasn't raising lions. He was building an army. Under Makulu's shadow, the brothers started to change. They weren't those fuzzy little balls of yarn anymore. That red dust of the Sabi sand seemed to bake into their skin. They started getting thick. Their shoulders started to broaden. Their voices changed from those high-pitched squeaks to low, guttural growls that made the birds stop singing when they heard them. And here's the crazy part. Because they had Makulu protecting them. They were eating better than any other cubs in Africa. They were growing faster. They were becoming giants themselves. As the months rolled by, the dynamic shifted. It wasn't just the big male and the cubs anymore. It was a unit, a pack, a gang. You'd see them on the move, and it was the most terrifying thing you could imagine. Makulu would be in the lead, his black mane flowing like a battle flag, and behind him 5 young, hungry, powerful males, all stepping in his footprints. They were learning his walk. They were learning his cruelty. They realized, probably for the first time in their lives, that they weren't afraid anymore. The hyenas that used to circle them in the dark, Now those hyenas stayed half a mile away, whimpering. The other male lions in the area, they heard the collective roar of these six, and they headed for the hills. The Sparta brothers were growing up, and they weren't the underdogs anymore. They were the Mapogos, and they were starting to realize that together, as a gang of six, there wasn't a single thing in the world that could stop them. The boys were becoming men, and the men were becoming monsters. But every army needs a test. Every warlord needs a war. And let me tell you, the peace in the Sabi sand was about to be ripped to shreds. Because now that they were big enough, they didn't just want to survive. They wanted everything. Grab another log for the fire, will you? It's getting a bit chilly, and this next part, well, it's the part where the shadows get a lot longer. So, we left off with the boys becoming men. But here's the thing about the lion world that nobody tells you in the movies. There's no happily ever after for young males. When you grow up and you start looking like a threat to the status quo, you get the boot. Picture this. One day, you're the prince of the pride, protected by your moms and the big guy, Mehulu. The next, you're an outcast. The Sparta pride reached a breaking point. You can't have six massive, hungry males hanging around, eating all the food and making the territory a target. So, the pride did what nature demands. They kicked them out. Imagine the feeling. One morning, you're part of a family. By nightfall, you're all homeless, in the middle of the deadliest wilderness on Earth. You've got no territory. You've got no females to hunt for you. You've just got your brothers and the dirt under your claws. They were bachelors, roaming through the no man's land of the Sabi sand. And let me tell you, being a nomad is a death sentence for most. You're constantly trespassing. You're always looking over your shoulder because if you wander into the wrong patch of bush, the local higher king will find you and he will end you. That first year on their own, you wouldn't believe how brutal it was. Forget the image of the majestic hunter. These guys were a mess. They were like a gang of teenagers who had never lived away from home. They were big, yeah, but they were clumsy. They were loud. They'd try to sneak up on a herd of impala, and one of them would snap a dry branch or trip over his own feet. And poof, the dinner was gone. They were starving. I mean, really, truly starving. Picture their ribs sticking out through their dusty fur. Their hip bones were sharp enough to cut you. They were walking skeletons, just roaming the heat, their tongues hanging out, looking for anything, a dead carcass, a scrap left by a leopard, a baby warthog, anything to stop the cramping in their bellies. Hunger isn't just a feeling out there. It's a madness. It starts to eat your brain. You stop being afraid of things you should be afraid of. You start looking at things that could kill you and thinking, "Mom, maybe I can eat that." Well, and that's when everything changed. One night, the moon was just a sliver in the sky. It was dark, the kind of dark where you can't see your own hand in front of your face. The Mapogos, that's what they were becoming now. A gang were huddled near a watering hole. They hadn't eaten a real meal in days. Their stomachs were screaming, and then they heard it. A deep, wet grunt. Out of the darkness, this massive shape appeared. It was a hippo. Now listen to me. You do not mess with hippos. They are 3 tons of pure prehistoric muscle and bad attitude. They have jaws that can snap a crocodile in half like a toothpick. Even the biggest, meanest lions usually give a hippo a wide berth. It's just not worth the risk. But like I said, hunger makes you do insane things. The hippo was wandering on dry land, far from the safety of the water, looking for some grass to munch on. It thought it was safe. It thought nothing was stupid enough to touch it. The 6 brothers looked at each other. They didn't need to speak. The adrenaline was already pumping through their veins, hot and electric. Mahulu, the old general, took the lead. He didn't roar. He didn't give it away. He just started to circle. And the 5 brothers, they followed suit, fanning out like a tactical team. Suddenly, the hippo realized something was wrong. It swung its massive head around, peering into the gloom. It let out a roar that sounded like a freight train crashing, but the Mapogos didn't run. "Here's the crazy part," I whispered to the fire. "Usually a lion might take a swipe and then back off. Not these guys." Makulu lunged first. He threw his entire weight onto the hippo's back, his claws digging into that thick, leathery skin. The hippo went wild. It started spinning, snapping those giant tusks, trying to find something to bite. If it caught one of them, that brother was dead, gone. But then the other 5 swarmed. It wasn't a hunt. It was a street fight. It was a riot. Picture the chaos. The red dust flying everywhere, the sound of the hippo's agonizing bellows mixing with the guttural, demonic growls of 6 lions. They were all over it. 2 on the back, 1 on each leg, another trying to get at the throat. They were being tossed around like rag dolls, but they wouldn't let go. They were biting, scratching, pulling. They were using their collective weight to anchor this 3-ton beast to the spot. The hippo was powerful, but it was outnumbered 6-1. It was a war of attrition. The adrenaline was so high that they couldn't feel the bruises or the scrapes. They only felt the hunger and the drive to bring this monster down. It took hours. The sun was almost starting to peek over the horizon by the time the giant finally collapsed. The silence that followed was heavy. The only thing you could hear was the heavy, ragged breathing of 6 exhausted lions and the occasional crackle of the dry grass. They were covered in blood, not just the hippos, but their own. But they didn't care. They ate until their bellies were so full they could barely move. But something else happened that night. As they stood over that massive kill, their faces stained red in the morning light, something clicked. You could see it in their eyes. The fear was gone. The homeless feeling was gone. They looked at that hippo, a beast that was supposed to be untouchable, and they realized the truth. They realized that the rules of nature, the rules that said lions don't hunt hippos or lions stay away from the big stuff, those rules didn't apply to them anymore. With 6 of them working together, they weren't just a pride. They were a war machine. They realized that there wasn't a single living thing in the Sabi sand that could stand against them if they stayed together. They weren't just trying to survive anymore. They were ready to take over. They weren't bachelors anymore. They were the Mapogo Coalition, and the world was about to find out exactly what that meant. The wilderness years were over. Now they wanted a kingdom, and God help anyone who was sitting on the throne they wanted. You want to hear about what they did when they finally marched back into the heart of the Sabi sand to find their first real territory? Because it wasn't a peaceful homecoming. It was an invasion. Lean in a little closer. I need to make sure you're really listening, because if you don't understand this part, you don't understand the Mapogos at all. Up until now, I've told you about how these 6 brothers survived the drought, how they survived being homeless, and how they learned to hunt the impossible. I've told you about Makulu, the big guy, the one who kept them all together. And you're probably thinking, okay, so they're just a really successful gang of lions. But every gang has that one guy. You know the one. He's the one everyone else is a little bit afraid of. He's the one who doesn't just want to win the fight. He wants to break the person he's fighting. He's the one who seems to have a wire crossed somewhere in his brain. In the Mapogo Coalition, that was a brother named Mr. T. Picture this. You see him walking through the tall golden grass. He's not the biggest of the brothers. Makulu still holds that title, but you'd know Mr. T in a heartbeat. He had this weird raggedy mane that didn't grow in right. It stood up in this stiff, dark ridge along the back of his neck like a mohawk. That's why the Rangers called him Mr. T, after the guy from the A-team. He looked like a punk. He looked like he was looking for a reason to snap. But it wasn't just the hair. It was the eyes. I've spent a lot of time around animals, and usually, when a lion looks at you, you see a predator. You see hunger, or maybe you see boredom. But when people looked at Mr. T, they saw something else. They saw intent. His eyes were intense, yellow, and completely cold. There was a madness in them. He didn't look like a normal lion. He looked like a soul that had been forged in a very dark place. You wouldn't believe the nickname the Rangers and the locals eventually gave him. They didn't call him the King or the Warrior. They leaned in and whispered it. Satan. Now, think about that. These are people who live in the bush. They see death every single day. They see leopards strangling impalas. They see hyenas ripping things apart while they're still alive. They're used to the cruelty of nature. So, for them to look at one specific lion and name him after the devil, that tells you everything you need to know. It wasn't a joke. It was a warning. Here's the crazy part. Most lions follow a set of rules. You kill because you're hungry. You kill because another male is trying to take your territory and your females. It's business. It's never personal. But for Mr. T, it was always personal. He started doing things that made no sense in the natural world. Picture a night where the coalition finds a rival male. Usually, the fight happens, the loser runs away, and the winners take the land. If they kill him, they do it quickly, not Mr. T. There were times when he would corner a rival, and instead of going for the throat, the quick kill, he'd go for the spine. He'd bite down until he heard that sickening crunch paralyzing the other lion. And then he wouldn't finish it. He'd just sit there. He'd watch the other lion struggle, watch him realize he could never walk again. And then Mr. T would just walk away. He'd leave the animal there to be eaten alive by hyenas or to die of thirst in the sun. He didn't eat the things he killed half the time. He'd hunt down a hyena, catch it, and rip it to pieces just because it was there. He wasn't hungry. He was just enjoying the violence. He was the first lion anyone had ever seen that seemed to actually get a thrill out of the suffering of others. He was a psychopath in a 400-pound body, and you could feel it in the air. Imagine you're out there in the Sabi sand. Normally, the bush is full of noise. You've got birds chirping, monkeys barking, insects buzzing. When a normal pride of lions walks through, the animals give them space, but life goes on. But when the Mapogos were on the move and Mr. T was in the lead, everything went dead silent. It was like the whole jungle held its breath. The monkeys wouldn't even scream. They'd just hide in the highest branches and tremble. The birds would stop singing. Even the wind seemed to die down. It was a heavy, suffocating kind of silence. The kind of silence that tells you something very bad is about to happen. And it wasn't just the other animals. You'd see the 5 brothers, these massive, battle-hardened killers, and even they seemed to give Mr. T his space. They didn't play with him like they played with each other. They didn't nudge him. When he walked by, they'd watch him out of the corners of their eyes. They knew what he was. They knew that the wire in his head didn't care if you were a brother or an enemy, if you got on his bad side. But here's the thing that made the Mapogos the most terrifying force in African history. They had Makulu, right? Makulu was the brain. He was the general. He was the one who decided where they went and which territories they were going to take. He was calm, he was calculated, and he was wise. And then he had Mr. T. If Makulu was the king, Mr. T was the executioner. Makulu would point at a kingdom and say, "I want that." And then he would let Mr. T off the leash. Together, they were the perfect nightmare. You had the intelligence and the leadership of the big guy and the unhinged, demonic cruelty of the psychopath. They weren't just a coalition anymore. They were a regime, and they were finally ready. They had spent their wilderness years growing strong. They had learned how to kill anything that breathed, and they had found their true nature. They didn't want to just roam anymore. They were tired of being nomads. They looked north, toward the heart of the Sabi sand, where the lush lands were, where the big herds of buffalo lived, and where the reigning kings sat on their thrones. Those kings had no idea what was coming for them. They thought they were tough. They thought they knew what a fight was. But they had never met anyone like Mr. T. They had never met a lion who didn't care about the rules. Are you ready to hear about the night the Mapogos finally crossed the border? Because when they did, they didn't just fight a battle. They started a massacre. The Satan of the Sabi. Sand was about to show everyone exactly why he earned that name. Throw another log on the fire, will you? The shadows are starting to creep in, and this is the part of the story where the darkness really takes hold. We've talked about them as cubs. We've talked about their Satan, and we've talked about their hunger. But now we're talking about the reign of terror. Picture this. The Mapogos didn't just enter the Sabi sand. They didn't sneak across the border like thieves in the night. They marched. I've talked to people who were there, rangers who spent their lives in those trucks. They told me you'd be driving down the main dirt roads in the middle of the night, and suddenly your headlights would hit them. You wouldn't see one lion. You'd see 6. They moved down the center of the road like a military convoy. They didn't move for the trucks. The trucks moved for them. They eventually controlled over 170,000 acres of land. To give you an idea, that's bigger than some cities. And in every square inch of that dirt, they were the law, the judge, and the executioner. They were untouchable. They were the most powerful force the African bush had ever seen. But a kingdom that big needs a lot of meat to keep it running. And that brings us to the Black Death. You ever heard of the Cape buffalo? Out here, hunters call them the Black Death for a reason. They aren't like the cows you see on a farm. They are a ton of grumpy, solid muscle with horns like armor plating. They don't run away, they charge. They've killed more hunters than almost any other animal in Africa. A single lion trying to take a buffalo is usually asking for a death sentence. One wrong move, one hook from those massive horns, and the lion is ripped open from belly to chin. But normal rules didn't apply to the Mapogos. I want you to imagine a night where the air is so thick you can taste the dust. The six brothers have found a massive buffalo bull, a real monster, a lone veteran of 1,000 fights. Usually, a pride would look at a bull like that and say, "No thanks." But the Mapogos, they surrounded him. Here's the crazy part. It wasn't a quick ambush. It was a siege. You'd hear the buffalo bellowing. And if you've never heard a buffalo scream, it sounds like a literal train horn, a deep, vibrating blast of pure defiance. The brothers didn't care. They swarmed him. Picture the violence of it. The dust is kicking up so thick you can barely see the yellow of their eyes. You hear the thud of 500-pound bodies hitting the ground. You hear the snap of bone. The buffalo is swinging his head, those horns whistling through the air, missing Mr. T's head by an inch. But while the bull is focused on one, the other 5 are tearing at his haunches, pulling his weight down. They didn't hunt that buffalo. They dismantled him. By the time it was over, the 6 of them were standing in a circle of red dirt, panting, covered in blood from head to tail. They looked like something out of a horror movie, and they did this over and over again. They were eating things that should have been killing them, but it wasn't just the food. It was the cleansing. See, the Mapogos had a personal vendetta against hyenas. Now everyone knows lions and hyenas hate each other, but this was different. This was war. And Mr. T, remember Satan? He was the one leading the charge. There's a story about them finding a massive clan of hyenas. Normally, a lion will kill a hyena if it gets too close to the food. But Mr. T, he started hunting them for sport. One night, the 6 of them tracked a clan back to their den. They didn't want the meat. They wanted the matriarch, the queen of the hyenas. They tore through the clan like a chainsaw through paper. Mr. T eventually caught the matriarch, and he didn't just kill her. He made sure every other hyena in the area saw it happen. It was a message. This is our land now. You don't live here anymore. You only exist because we haven't found you yet. After that, the hyenas in the Sabi sand changed. They stopped laughing. They went silent. They became ghosts in their own home. But you want to know the really dark part? The part that makes people's voices drop when they talk about this. It's the body count. You wouldn't believe it if I told you, but the records are there. In just 1 year, one single year, the Mapogo Coalition killed over 100 other lions. Think about that number for a second. Let it sink in. They weren't just fighting for territory. They were an extermination squad. They would find a pride, kill the reigning males, and then they wouldn't stop there. They would wipe out the females. They would wipe out the cubs. They were systematically erasing every other bloodline in the Sabi sand. They were clearing the map so that only Mapogo blood remained. It was a genocide. It was a massacre that lasted for years. By the end of it, they had killed so many rivals that there were almost no other adult males left in the entire reserve. It was a silent kingdom ruled by 6 monsters. And that leads me to the sound. Lean in, because this is the part that still gives me chills. Imagine you're lying in your tent. It's 3 a.m. The world is totally still. And then it starts. A roar, but not just one. It starts with mahulu, a deep bass rumble that you don't hear with your ears. You feel it in your chest, in your bones. And then, one by one, the other 5 join in. When 6 fully grown male lions roar at the exact same time, it doesn't sound like an animal. It sounds like thunder rolling across the ground. It sounds like the earth is literally cracking open. The vibration is so powerful, it shakes the leaves off the trees. It travels for miles. When that sound hit the air, everything, and I mean everything, stopped breathing. The impala froze. The leopards climbed higher. The birds went stone still in the dark. Every living thing in that 170,000-acre kingdom knew exactly who was talking. They were the kings of the night. They had won. They had the land, they had the food, and they had the fear of every living soul. But here's the thing about a reign built on blood. It's hard to keep it together. When you have 6 kings, eventually they start looking at each other. They start wondering who's really in charge. The terror was at its peak, but the cracks were starting to show. And you wouldn't believe what happened when the brothers finally turned on each other. You want to hear about the day the coalition split? The day the Mapogo Empire started to bleed from the inside? Listen, you hear that? That's the wind shifting. It's coming from the north now, and it's carrying a different kind of chill. It's the kind of cold that doesn't just touch your skin. It gets inside your bones. We've spent the last few nights talking about the Mapogos like they were gods, and for a while they were. They had the land, they had the buffalo, and they had the fear of every living thing. From the Sabi River to the Sand River, they had reached the top of the mountain. But here's the thing about the top of the mountain. There's no place left to go but down. You've heard the saying, right? Absolute power corrupts. Usually we say that about kings or politicians, but let me tell you, it applies to monsters too. By this point, the 6 brothers had killed everything that stood in their way. They had wiped out the rival males. They had silenced the hyenas. They owned the whole world. But when you're a war machine and you run out of wars to fight, you don't just stop being a soldier. You start looking for a new enemy. And if there's no one left on the outside, you start looking at the guy standing right next to you. The rot started in the heart of the coalition, and it started with him, Mr. T. Picture this. It's a quiet night in the Pride lands. The hunting has been easy. The Pride is resting. There are cubs everywhere, little fuzzy bundles of energy, the sons and daughters of the 6 brothers. These cubs were the future. They were the reason the Mapogos had fought so hard to build this empire. They were the legacy. But Mr. T didn't care about legacy. He cared about Mr. T. Lean in close, because I'm about to tell you something that still makes the hair on my arms stand up. In the lion world, there are rules, hard, unwritten laws of the bush. One of those laws is that you don't touch the cubs of your own coalition. You protect them like they're your own, because, in a way, they are. They carry your brother's blood. But Mr. T decided he was done with the rules. He started doing the unforgivable. He started killing the cubs. And I'm not talking about enemy cubs from a rival pride. I'm talking about his own brother's children. You wouldn't believe the horror of those nights. Imagine you're one of the Sparta lionesses. You've hunted for these males. You've bled for them. You've raised their young. You're lying in the grass and you see Mr. T approaching in the moonlight. You don't growl because he's family. He's the uncle. He's one of the kings. And then, in a flash of movement so fast you can't even blink, he lunges. The screams. Man, the screams of those lionesses. They weren't just fighting for their babies. They were screaming in total, broken confusion. They couldn't understand why the protector had become the predator. Here's the crazy part, the why behind it. It wasn't just madness. It was cold, calculated selfishness. See, a female lion won't mate again as long as she has cubs to raise. Mr. T didn't want to wait his turn. He wanted the females to go back into heat right then, right there, so he could be the one to father the next litter. He didn't want his brother's blood to rule the Sabi sand. He wanted his own. He was willing to butcher his own family's future just to satisfy his own ego. It wasn't just a kill. It was a betrayal of the highest order. It was evil. One by one, the cubs began to disappear. The other brothers would wake up from a nap or come back from a patrol and find the grass stained red and their offspring gone. Can you imagine the atmosphere in the pride, the tension? The band of brothers wasn't a family anymore. It was a ticking time bomb. The air felt heavy, like the minutes before a massive thunderstorm hits. Every time Mr. T walked into a clearing, the other brothers would go stiff. Their tails would twitch. Their eyes would lock onto him. The trust that had kept them alive during the drought, the bond that had let them take down hippos together, it was snapped. It was gone. And then came the face-off. It happened near a dry riverbed under the skeletal branches of a leadwood tree. Mahulu, the big one, the general, finally had enough. Mahulu was the one who had adopted these guys. He was the one who had shielded them when they were nothing but skin and bones. He was the reason Mr. T was even alive. Mahulu stood in the path blocking Mr. T. Picture these two giants. Mahulu, with his massive scarred frame and his calm, heavy presence, and Mr. T, with his ragged mohawk mane and those Satan eyes vibrating with a nervous, violent energy. They stood nose to nose. No one was roaring. It was worse than that. It was a low, guttural rumble that you could feel in the soles of your feet. It was the sound of a civil war brewing. Mahulu bared his teeth, those huge, yellowed canines, and let out a hiss that sounded like steam escaping a pipe. He was telling his brother, "No more. I see you. I know what you are." For a long minute, neither of them moved. It was a standoff between the king and the executioner. The other brothers were watching from the sidelines, their ears pinned back, ready to jump in but not knowing which side to take. In that moment, the Mapogo coalition died. Even though they were all still standing there, the heart of it was gone. You can't build a kingdom on the bodies of your own children and expect the walls to stay up. Mr. T eventually backed down that day, slipping away into the shadows with a snarl. But the damage was done. The fracture was deep and it was jagged. The Sabi sand felt different after that. The silence was no longer the silence of respect. It was the silence of a house where everyone is, waiting for the first person to draw a knife. You could feel it in every patrol, every hunt. They weren't moving as a unit anymore. They were moving as individuals who happened to be in the same place. Someone was going to have to leave, or they were going to kill each other until there was only one monster left standing. The reign of terror was turning inward. The brothers were becoming each other's prey. And you wouldn't believe how it finally broke. It wasn't a slow fade. It was a violent, sudden split that divided the kingdom in two. Put another log on, the fire's getting low, and you're going to want the light for this part. We've talked about the blood, the takeover, and that sick feeling of betrayal. But now, we're talking about the end of an era. We're talking about the split. Picture this. You've got this army, right? 6 of the most terrifying killing machines Africa has ever seen. They're a wall of muscle and teeth. As long as they stand together, they are a god. Nothing can touch them. But like I said, the rot was inside. The trust was gone. It didn't end with a massive, bloody civil war. It wasn't some cinematic battle where brothers tore each other apart in the mud. It was actually much colder than that. It was like a bad divorce. One day, they just stopped looking at each other. They stopped sharing the same patch of shade. And then, the line was drawn. The army of 6 was officially dead. On one side, you had the Western Four. That was Mahulu and 3 of the other brothers. They stayed in their heartland, the place they knew best. They were the stable ones, if you can call a group of mass murderers stable. But on the other side, that's where things got wild. Mr. T, our Mohawked Satan, and his closest ally, a brother named Kinky Tail, decided they were done. Kinky Tail got his name because of a break in his tail that made it hook at the end. And let me tell you, he was just as mean as Mr. T. They were the 2 wildest, most aggressive members of the whole gang. They turned their backs on their brothers and marched east. Now, here's the crazy part. Without Mahulu there to be the general, the one who kept them disciplined and focused, Mr. T and Kinky, Tail became pure, unadulterated chaos. They were a 2-man hit squad. Think about the bond between those 2 for a second. They were inseparable. You wouldn't see one without the other 10 feet away. They slept side by side. They hunted together. And when they fought, they were like a whirlwind. They didn't have the numbers of the 6 anymore, but they had twice the fury. They patrolled their new eastern territory like they were looking for a reason to burn the whole world down. They were roaring every night, practically daring anyone to come and try them. They were acting like they were still 6 lions strong, even though it was just the 2 of them. And that territory they moved into, you wouldn't believe it. It was hostile. It was open land, less bush to hide in, more flat plains where you could see for miles. It felt empty. The air out there was different. It was quiet, too quiet. When you're used to the thick bush of the West, the East feels like you're standing on a stage with a spotlight on you. Mr. T and Kinky Tail didn't care. They were the Mapogos. They were the legends. They thought they were the only monsters in the dark. But they were wrong. Lean in close, because this is where the story shifts. This is where the hunter starts to become the prey, while Mr. T and Kinky Tail were busy roaring at the moon and picking fights with anything that moved. They were being watched, And I don't mean by a nervous impala or a hiding leopard. There was a new name starting to whisper through the Sabi sand, the Majingilane. The Majingilane weren't like the Mapogos. They didn't have the history. They didn't have the Satan reputation. But they had something else. They were five young, powerful, peak-conditioned males. And they were smart. I want you to imagine these guys. We call them the ghosts. Why? Because they didn't roar. They didn't announce themselves to the world like Mr. T did. They moved through that long golden grass of the east like smoke. While Mr. T and Kinky Tail were out in the open, making all that noise, the 5 Majingalanes were just sitting, watching. They stayed in the shadows for weeks. Think about the patience that takes. 5 massive lions lying dead still in the grass, just counting. 1, 2. They were watching the 2 brothers patrol. They were watching them eat. They were looking for the weakness. You wouldn't believe the chill you'd feel if you were out there. You'd be looking at Mr. T, looking at how tough he seemed, but then you'd catch a glimpse of a pair of yellow eyes in the dark, 300 yards away, and then another pair, and another. The Majingilanes were counting the odds. 5 against 2. They were waiting for the perfect moment. They were waiting for a night when the wind was howling and the rain was washing away the scent. A night where no one would hear the screams. The kings of the night were being stalked by a new nightmare. Mr. T and Kinky Tail were acting like they owned the world, but they were actually walking into a trap that had been set the moment they left their brothers. And the crazy part, they had no idea. They thought they were the scariest things in the woods. They thought their names alone would protect them. But you can't fight 5 ghosts at once. The storm was coming. Not just a weather storm, but a storm of teeth and claws that was going to settle the score once and for all. You feel that? That little prickle on the back of your neck? That's what it felt like in the east that week. Like there were eyes on you from every bush, every shadow. Like the ground was waiting to drink. Stoke that fire one more time. You're going to need the warmth for this part. Because what happened on that night in June 2010? It's the kind of thing that makes the blood in your veins turn to slush. Picture this. It's deep winter in the Sabi sand. The sun has been down for hours, and the air is biting. But it wasn't a calm night. The wind was howling. Really screaming through the acacia trees. Now, you might think a big wind is just weather. But in the bush, the wind is a weapon. It's a mask. It rustles the grass so loud that you can't hear a footstep until it's right on top of you. It blows the scent away so you don't know who's downwind. Mr. T and Kinky Tail were out on patrol. Just the 2 of them. They were deep in the Eastern Territory, far from Mahulu and the rest of the brothers. They were doing what they always did, acting like they owned the stars themselves. They were roaring into the dark, their voices competing with the wind. It was pure arrogance. They thought they were the only monsters out there. But here's the crazy part. They weren't alone, not even close. Remember the ghosts I told you about? The Majingilane Coalition? Those 5 young, powerful males had been following the brothers for weeks. They had been counting. They knew the math. 5 is more than 2. Always. The trap didn't just spring. It exploded. One second, Mr. T and Kinky Tail are walking through the tall, dry grass, their manes blowing in the gale. The next, the ground seemed to rise up and bite them. The Majingilanes didn't roar a warning. They didn't growl. They just came. 5 massive shapes launched themselves out of the shadows like a synchronized hit squad. The noise, man, you wouldn't believe the noise. It wasn't a lion roar like you hear on TV. It was a wall of sound. It was the sound of 500-pound killing machines hitting each other at full speed. It was the sound of bones slamming against bone, of teeth scraping against teeth. In an instant, the night was a mess of dust, blood, and fur. Mr. T and Kinky Tail fought like demons. They were the Mapogos, right? They had killed hippos. They had murdered 100 lions. They knew how to fight. But like I said, you can't fight math. Every time Kinky Tail tried to throw one off his back, 2 more were there to take its place. Every time Mr. T tried to snap at a throat, he was getting hit from the side. It was a brawl, a complete and total street fight in the dirt. The dust was kicking up so thick they were probably choking on it, blinded by it, while the Majingalanes just kept coming, wave after wave. And then the moment happened. The moment the legend truly broke. In the middle of the chaos, the fight split. It's a tactic these coalitions use. They separate the target. 4 of the Majingalanes managed to isolate Kinky Tail. They swarmed him, using their collective weight to anchor him to the ground. I want you to slow down and imagine this, because it's the hardest part to hear. Kinky Tail, the bravest, meanest brother, was pinned. He was flat on his back in the dirt, 4 sets of jaws tearing at his legs, his spine, his belly. He was roaring, but it wasn't a roar of war anymore. It was a roar of agony. He was fighting with everything he had, biting, scratching, twisting, but he was being eaten alive while he was still standing. Now, where was Mr. T? He had been pushed back by the 5th Majingilane. He was blooded. His mohawk mane was a mess, and he was panting so hard his chest was heaving. He heard his brother. He heard Kinky Tail screaming for help. And for a second, just a split second, the psychopath showed he had a soul. Mr. T turned back. He actually started to run back toward the pile of lions. He was going in to save his best friend, his only ally left in the world. He was going to face certain death to stand by his brother. But then he stopped. He stood there 20 feet away, watching. He saw the 4 Majingalanes on top of Kinky Tail. He saw the way they were, dismantling him. He saw the 5th lion turning toward him, ready to finish the job. He realized it. He did the math. If he went in there, there wouldn't be a Mapogo legend anymore. There would just be 2 dead bodies in the dirt. The Satan of the Sabi sand, the lion who feared nothing, looked at his brother one last time. Kinky Tail's eyes were probably searching for him in the dark. And Mr. T, he turned around. He didn't walk. He ran. He sprinted into the blackness of the bush, leaving his brother to the ghosts. He disappeared into the howling wind, his heavy paws thudding against the ground as he fled for his life. And then, the scariest part of all happened, the silence. Once the running stopped and the wind died down for just a second, the only thing left was the sound of Kinky Tail's breath rattling in his chest and the low, satisfied growls of the 4 Majingalanes as they finished their work. The eastern 2 were gone. The Mapogo Empire had been cut in half in a single hour. When the sun came up the next morning, the Majingalanes were still there. They were sitting around what was left of Kinky Tail, looking toward the west. They weren't done. They had tasted Mapogo blood, and they liked it. But what about Mr. T? Imagine being him that night, running through the dark, alone for the first time in his entire life. No brothers, no allies, just the memory of those screams behind him. He was a king without a kingdom, a soldier without an army. You think that's the end of him? You think he just faded away? Not Mr. T. Because a psychopath who has nothing left to lose is the most dangerous thing on the planet. He was going back to the only thing he knew, his brothers in the West. But would they take him back after he'd abandoned the East? And what happens when the Morgingalanes decide to follow his tracks? Take a long look at those embers. See how the edges are turning gray? That's what happens when a fire has given everything it has. It's the end of the burn, and that's exactly where we are in the story. We're at the end of the Mapogos. Picture this, the morning after that horrific night in the east. The sun starts to crawl over the horizon, but it's a cold, pale light. The Majingalane ghosts have moved off into the shade to sleep off their kill. And out of the thicket, a shadow moves. It's Mr. T. He came back. You wouldn't believe it after seeing him run. But he came back. Maybe it was guilt. Or maybe it was just that crossed wire in his head finally snapping back into place. He walked onto that patch of crushed, red-stained grass where the fight happened. I want you to imagine the sound he made. It wasn't a roar of war. It was what they call a contact call, a low, mournful sound that lions use to find their family. He was calling for Kinky Tail. He walked in circles around the spot where his brother was dismantled, his nose to the dirt, calling and calling. But there was only silence. The wind had died down, and the only thing answering him was the buzzing of flies. For the first time in his life, from the moment he was a fuzzy cub in the Sparta Pride to the moment he became the most feared killer in Africa, Mr. T was completely, utterly alone. He didn't have the General Mahulu to lead him. He didn't have Kinky Tail to back him up. He was just a lion in a very big, very empty world. And that's when the psychopath started to fade. Fast forward 2 years. You wouldn't believe it was the same animal. By 2012, Mr. T had become a ghost. He had spent some time drifting back toward his brothers in the West, but the coalition was a shadow of its former self. They were old, they were tired. Eventually, he was back on his own, wandering the fringes of the territory he used to own. Picture him now. He's not the mohawked warrior anymore. He's limping. One of his back legs is stiff from an old injury. His ribs are showing through his skin like the rafters of a ruined house. His mane is thin, and his face is a mess of black, leathery scars. He wasn't a king anymore. He was a scavenger. He was hiding in the thickest bushes, waiting for a leopard to leave a scrap of meat or looking for a sick impala. Imagine that. The lion who hunted hippos, the lion who killed 100 rivals, was now reduced to licking the bones of someone else's kill. It's a sad image, isn't it? But out here, nature doesn't do sad. It just does next. The end came in March 2012. It was a hot afternoon, the kind where the air feels like it's vibrating. Mr. T had wandered into a patch of land controlled by a new group, 4 young, powerful males called the Salati. Boys, they were exactly what the Mapogos used to be, young, hungry, and looking for a throne. They found him near a small watering hole. Mr. T was too tired to run this time. Maybe he was just done with running. Here's the crazy part. Most old lions, when they see 4 young males coming, they try to slip away. They try to hide, but not him. Mr. T stood up. Imagine the scene. You've got these 4 young titans, their coats clean, their muscles bulging, circling this one ragged, old, scarred-up survivor. They were hissing, their ears pinned back, sizing him up. They could tell he was a legend just by the way he looked at them. Even in his weakened state, he had that Satan look in his eyes. One of the Salati boys lunged, then another. This is the part where you'd expect him to go down easy. But remember who we're talking about. Mr. T didn't go down like a victim. He went out like a Mapogo. He threw himself into the fight. He was snapping at throats, swinging his paws with everything he had left. For a few minutes, he actually held them off. He was a whirlwind of gray fur and old rage. He was fighting for Kinky Tail, for Makulu, for the 170,000 acres they used to rule. But you can't beat time, and you can't beat 4 against 1. The weight of them finally brought him to the dirt. It wasn't quick, and it wasn't clean. It was a brawl until the very last second, when the dust finally settled and the Salati boys walked away to claim their new kingdom. The last true warrior of the Mapogos stayed in the sand. The silence that followed, that was the real end of the era. Look at the fire now. It's almost gone, right? Just a few glowing coals. That's the legacy of the Mapogo Coalition. They were a lightning strike. For a few years, they changed the rules of the world. 6 brothers who refused to die as cubs, who survived a drought, who took over a territory the size of a city, and who left a body count of over 100 lions behind them. We will never see anything like them again. The Mapogos were a glitch in the system, a moment where nature allowed 6 monsters to work together and see just how far they could go. But as you sit here in the dark, just remember the lesson of the Sabi sand. Nature is a circle. It gives you the power, it gives you the teeth, and it lets you feel like a god for a little while. But eventually, it always comes back to collect. The Mapogos lived by the sword, and every single one of them died by it, except for maybe Makulu, the old general who vanished into the bush and was never seen again. Some say he's still out there, a ghost in the long grass, watching the new kings make the same mistakes they did. So, when you go to sleep tonight and you hear something moving in the brush outside your tent, don't worry, it's probably just the wind. But then again, in the Sabi sand, the wind usually has teeth. I hope you enjoyed the journey of the Mapogo Brothers. If you're interested in another true dark legend, would you like me to tell you the story of the ghost and the darkness? The man-eating lions of Tsavo who stopped an entire British railroad in its tracks?